Listen, everybody, thanks for coming. I'm happy today to introduce Ken Smith. Fortunately, Ken wrote up some of his many titles. His CV has quite a number. He is Distinguished Professor of Family and Consumer Studies at the University of Utah. And the really cool thing he does, and the name is mutated a little bit over the years, but you direct an amazing center that contains no end of data on essentially family histories, genealogy, and the like. And the really cool thing is not only is Ken here to talk to us today, but he's part of a NSF-funded project with Hugh Jun, Irma, Jerry Behrman, who knows else who's around here. He's done an incredible amount of work on any number of subjects. I will just highlight the fact that you have discovered, along with our colleagues John McDonald, Greg Ridgway, and others, that light rail is good for your health. I love those studies. As somebody who takes the train all the time, it's all good. So, I think socially it's a good thing, but it turns out from a public health perspective, the stuff works too. One of only many dozens and dozens and dozens of interesting papers. Ken, thanks for being here. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Herb. I appreciate it. So I'm going to be mindful of the clock. I will just follow that introduction by saying that if you didn't, according to one study we did, if you weren't riding light rail, this is in Salt Lake City, and then you took it up, you actually lost weight, which it's hard to find any kind of large public intervention like that where people actually lose weight. So we were really pleased with that finding. So I took Mark Hayward's paper, some of you probably know, that's called The Long Arm of Childhood, and we just added this clever adaptation to it. And so I'm going to talk about this larger effort, and let me just get right into it because I know time will go quickly. So what I'm going to do is organize my presentation into rough thirds. I'm going to talk about this project we've had going called the Early Life Conditions and Survival and Health Study, which we affectionately call the ELCS project, ELCS. And then I'm going to talk about the Utah Population Database, which I have been involved with in all the years since when I left graduate school at Cornell. I went to Utah. And I was involved with the development of the UPDB from the very beginning, so it's something I consider my first child. And so I have a lot of thoughts and things I'd like to just share with you. And then I'm going to get, for the last third, talk about some selected findings on the topic at hand that'll touch on these various outcomes. And I'm just going to really kind of give you a sample and then and then try to sum it up. And along the way, I'm proud of having lived in Utah, and I do try to show you these pictures along the way. This is not a natural formation. This is an art project, which comes and goes depending upon the level of the lake. What I want to do is really talk about kind of life histories, the big sweep of time, and what happens early in your life and what might affect what happens later in life. And so these are kind of my main points. I really want to talk about the value of linking administrative records and the way that we've done it. We're not the only ones, but we've been at it for a while. I want to talk about family health history as an early life condition. If there's time, there's some work that we've done on historic shocks as an early exposure. We've done a lot on parental death in childhood. I think that is one of our it's a very unambiguous exposure early in life that can have long-term effects. And then talk about something that borders on gene-environment interaction. It's really more familial history and environment. And then touch on some other final points on the end that you can see there. So I hope I can get through all of that today. So I just wanted to point out the idea very quickly of early life conditions, or something that happens early in life affects what's happened to you later in life. And here's something I'm sure you're all familiar with. This is a publication, 1873. And in it, the author talks about early life conditions, and he has this, anyway, you can kind of read it real quickly there, but he talks about life is developmental death. It's not a very cheery concept, but the moment you're born, you're on your way to death. So I just want to leave you with that cheery thought, but that was about 150 years ago, that quote. I like to point it out just because it's really kind of an old idea. I also want to tip my hat to Glenn Elder, who was one of my mentors at Cornell. And I've mentioned to some of you, Paul Allison, who was there at the time, was also one of my mentors at Cornell. And then Glenn's work on the Great Depression, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, about what you can do when you find old, dusty data, clean them up, organize them, and the astonishing science that you can conduct with that work. And there was an early conference that led to this Life Course Dynamics book, and there's Glenn there, and there's me without any facial hair. So that was one of the early kind of turning points. And then I always like to point out Irma and Sam Preston's paper, which I often cite, and it was just one of those early papers that just was kind of packed it all in, and Irma, thank you for that, and I'm sure you've gotten royalties from this paper. But obviously, there's a long and storied history on this general topic. And actually, Sam Preston also had this is an adaptation of it. But in the interest of time, I won't go through all these different mechanisms. I'm sure most of you in the room are familiar with. But I do like the typology. I've added a few things to it. And this is just a nice organizing theme, and just mostly to point out that not all adversity is bad. Sometimes it does generate some at least empirical benefits. Some of that may be more mortality selection, but certainly immunity, so they're acquired immunity. These are some things that might lead to benefits. But this is, we've often refer back to this list and others about potential mechanisms, which I'll touch on here and there. So I would like to just start with a quick introduction that we have been interested in exceptional human longevity. So one of our first NIH grants was what is called the Utah Study of Fertility, Longevity, and Aging. And this is where we were fundamentally interested in the role of fertility and how it affects how we age. And one of my crowning successes is I came up with a great acronym that actually spells out US flag, that first title, and which I think is why we got funded. And then I'll talk about the ELKS project per se. But so in that early, the US flag study, we were looking for the social and genetic determinants of aging, and it's something that we're still working on. Identifying genes is not, I'm not a geneticist. We have a number of geneticists on the team. But this has really been my abiding interest, is really to understand why it is that some people can reach these amazing advanced ages and with all the nuts and bolts intact. And it's a tough question to address. We've been recruiting families. These are consented individuals where I can show their photographs. So this is a SIBSHIP of 4. These are the kinds of people that we were recruiting in Utah. So you can see their ages at the time we took the photograph. And so we were looking for really interesting families like this, 4 siblings. We found this brother-sister pair. He at 107, he was still had an active medical license. He was actually still seeing patients, amazingly. He died a few years after this photograph was taken. So these are the kinds of people that we were recruiting. We were getting DNA. We were looking at a lot of factors that might relate to their exceptional human longevity. And they are, for those of you who are doing any kind of demography of aging, I mean, we often work with statistical data alone, but we rarely see the subjects, but they are truly inspirational people, because they've got what we want, I would say. We continue to address this larger question about longevity. So this paper we just did with our colleagues in the Netherlands, and one of the point of this paper was just to address the other teams around the world that are trying to identify how do you pick the families if you want to identify, if you're trying to identify genes that might be related to longevity. It's a tricky business because the genes that are involved are probably multifaceted, and it's not going to be one silver bullet by everybody's estimation. And so this is I think just a preview of the kinds of things that we do with our database, which I'll talk about more detail in a moment. But we pretty much wanted to come up with a simple way to identify families that are enriched, likely with the genes that might be involved. And that to me looks a little fuzzy. I hope all of my slides are not going to be fuzzy, but there's a lot on this slide. But just to point out that as you move from left to right in each of these, so this is the Utah data on the top row, the Netherlands data on the bottom row, and then these are the first column is parents, second column is siblings. And as you move within a graph from left to right is that whether or not your parents or siblings are in the top 1%, next 9%, all the way down you're still within the top 20%. And what is your hazard rate for mortality? And it's clear that if you're in those very top sections, this one maybe less so because they have smaller data set, but pretty much if you're in the top 10% is the punchline here, and that we are enriching for people that we think are probably harboring genes for longevity. We also looked at whether it's your aunts and uncles. Sorry, this is a busy slide, but basically, if you are an individual and we go to your aunts and uncles, that your aunts and uncles are also speaking to you in terms of what trait there might be lurking in your lineage. And we go out even further. I won't show those slides, but basically everybody in your family gives you information about whether or not you might be harboring genes. And so the further out you go from your relatives, I would say, where they're living a long time and you are related to that individual by blood, the more likely there is probably some genetic aspect that you're sharing with that individual, especially when you're talking about extreme longevity. Because the closer the person is genetically to you, you're probably also sharing the environment, which if the objective is to find genes. So this particular study was focusing on that, but we're interested in all of it, the social, environmental, and genetic. Okay, so let me talk about the ELKS project. This is the renewal of that earlier U.S. flag project, and here, which is really what I want to focus on today, is on early life conditions and the complexity that entails to be able to look at the myriad number of factors that might be at play, and that might contribute to overall survival and health, but certainly for extreme longevity. And so these are basically the aims of the project. And it was really meant to build this resource to be able to be a platform for people interested in this life history approach, things that happen early in life and how they affect things later in life and all the attendant complications to that. And in order to do this, we had to really build a resource that would be a platform for asking these kinds of questions. One of the things, so here I'm just going to turn now to the database itself. Everybody in this room has benefited from the construction of large cohorts. We all rely at some point on large cohorts to do our work. And this slide just shows you kind of the usual set of data that probably many of us have used, and of course there are others. But our model is a little bit different in that we don't actually, you can do it, but our database, we don't actually go out and ask anybody anything. It's all administrative records. It's all medical records. It's all vital records. It's publicly available data that we can have access to. So this is what we have been working on, and this is what I've spent most of my career on. So let me just take a few minutes to talk about UPDB. And by the way, you guys are very courteous, and no one's asked a question yet, but I would prefer that you ask questions along the way. So I'll say UPDB, Utah Population Database. We refer to it as UPDB. We have a legal umbrella in Utah back in the early 80s that allows us to capture all this amazing data in the state of Utah without consent. This is an unusual and desirable position to be in, excuse me, where we can get this kind of information without the public's consent under certain conditions. So we have to provide identity protections, confidentiality, data security, and a robust process whereby we, the research community, can have access to it. So we've put all those in place, and we are always under scrutiny, but we're well into our past our 40th year of existence. And so what we do is we're able to link medical, public health, and demographic data together. And we are fundamentally about health research. If you wanted to do a pure history project or you wanted to study something unrelated to health, we would not be allowed to share the data. So we put all this together, and it changes every day because we're adding more data sources. And as new innovations come up, like DNA and genomic sequences, those are things that we start to build into the database.
Dan, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So you only can do that within Utah. So when somebody leaves Utah, you can't link them anymore.
Good question. So we do have mechanisms where we can follow people outside of Utah. The genealogies, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute, genealogies are family lineage oriented. They're not geospatial oriented. So there's a big chunk of our genealogy data that is not geography bound, but it does have a Utah-centric component to it. I think you guys have a census RDC here. And so we just got ours funded this last 6 months. And so one of our objectives is to link our data here to the RDC under the right conditions. And that will give us, we can find people even if they don't live in Utah. So we're always concerned about the selection of people that stay in Utah, but we do, well, in brief, one of the things we can do right now is we do link to the Social Security Administration. So we can actually see if people have left the state and died. So there's other information that we do have. Did you have a question?
Yes. Is this outdated regardless of the insurance that they have and the hospital they go?
Yeah, let me get to that in a minute, but I think I'll address that question here in a moment. So why would you want to do this in Utah? So the original purpose of why this started in Utah is this. So this is one of the patriarchs of the Mormon faith. And by the way, our data sometimes is referred to as a Mormon genealogy. The genealogy part of our data is really about Utah, and it was with the assistance with the Mormon Church. But this is not a Mormon database. It's about everybody. And I would venture to say everybody in this room has data that is held by the Mormon Church. I'm confident that that's true because they capture data from every corner of the planet. And so you shouldn't be alarmed by that. You just feel like you're in the club. But one of the reasons why it started here is because we had large families. He happened to have 6 wives. Here he is right here, and it's hard to tell the wives from the daughters in this picture. But and I say this mostly just because it feeds into people's stereotypes. Polygamy was actually fairly rare, despite the reputation. You had to be wealthy, you had to be in high status in the church, you had to be able to afford it. So it was a fairly, it was largely practiced in a restricted period of time and only among a select set of individuals. It still goes on today. But it's not technically polygamy because the church doesn't recognize simultaneous marriages. But we do have large families. But we are our TFR now. Anybody want to guess what the Utah TFR is right now? It's under 2.2. So and the U.S. is what, 1.7 or so, around there. So yeah, we're above that, but the fertility rate has crashed. So even though we have large families historically, it's not like this. So this is why it started, and this was the backbone to be able to because genetics was kind of the early part of it, but also historical demographers were also part of the early development of the UPDB. And so what happens, and I won't dwell on this too much, but typically people would extract data from church records and other historic documents, and they would prepare this 3-generation, what's called a family group sheet. These were the original paper documents that were the backbone of the database. So there's 3 generations of information. This is our archival room. We still have all these paper versions, and each one of these pages is a 3-generation family with binders and rooms full of these. And those have all been computerized to create this amazing backbone of the genealogy. That's about 1.6 million people represented there. We're over 11 million now, so we've greatly expanded our genealogical holdings. This is I'm going to give you one quick illustration, then I want to get to the substantive part here in a minute. But this is the father and the mother in this photograph. They were married in 1853. They had 12 children, which would not have been that unusual. 9 of them survived to adulthood. And then this is the 3-generation pedigree. That married couple is right here in the middle. So there's the wife, and there's the mother and the father. And if you go up to the mother's parents up here, and you descend all the way to the bottom, on the maternal side, this couple up here, in our database, they're approaching 35,000 descendants of this couple right here. That's in 200 years, 35,000 descendants. So that's one couple. And so you have large families, and you throw in a little bit of polygamy here and there, and a back of the envelope exercise will show you that's not that difficult to achieve. This isn't even the largest pedigree that we have, but it just shows you the extent to which you have family data. Now, this is an extreme. We have a lot of what we would call skinny pedigrees, where the descending cone is more narrow. And we're interested in all of them, but this just shows you the kind of the depth of information that we have in terms of intergenerational data. We work with the Mormon Church. We have a lot of confidential data. For those of you who are skiers, you might recognize this canyon, Big Cottonwood Canyon. And right on the side of this mountain right here is this, what looks like Batman's retreat. And it's an environmentally controlled location where we back up our data once a month. And it's in a granite where there hasn't been any seismic activity in this mountain for as far as the geologists can tell us. And so this is where geology meets genealogy. And we like to tell people that you think you have mountains of data. We've got an actual mountain of data. So right now, their current estimates is they've got, so with the church, but it's a company. It's called Perpetual Storage. If you want to back up your thumb drive, for sure, work with Perpetual Storage. And it's an environmentally controlled area, and we back up everything once a month, whatever our updates are, and we put them in there for safekeeping. And all the primary records, religious records that the church has, are also stored here. But it's a business. Okay, so the data have been used by historical demographers over time. One of the more prominent, these are 3 of my colleagues, and Lee Bean was one of the original thinkers to develop the database, and Jerry Minot, who was my predecessor as director, and Doug Anderton, some of you may know, wrote this book around 1990. That was the first grant about fertility on the American frontier. It was really, if you're interested in the database, this is probably a must-read for just kind of the historical context.
I'm sorry, Ken.
Yeah.
Did you mention that it's supposed to be health research, or like did it change since then?
It's always been health research, and what is health? What is meant by health? So we are restricted by mandate that to be able to use the data, it has to be a health phenomenon. Fertility and the ability to reproduce is a health phenomenon. So this was an NICHD funded project that led to this book. And if you're doing anything on fertility, that qualifies. So health is very broadly construed. So it doesn't have to be a disease or thing like, is that your question? Okay, yeah. This is we examine and model these kinds of pedigrees a lot. There's a study, not so much for today's talk, but it's a nice picture, something called Ogden syndrome, which is a rare genetic disorder. And this particular pedigree, this radial pedigree, so the founders are right here in the middle, and the first generation is the next concentric ring on out. So this is covering 12 generations deep, and these are all of the descendants of that original couple. So I don't even know how many dots there are on this, but this is the kind of depth. So if you want to do anything genetic as well as environmental, you have the opportunity to be able to sort through the depth of the data with information, something like this. And we have tools that help us analyze and navigate these kinds of pedigrees. Okay, so I just want to say, this is not a talk about the Utah Population Database, but I just want to at least give you my one infomercial about it. Is that we are health oriented in what we have to do. In fact, it's required. This is just, these are the key databases that we get that tend to be Utah centric. And we have all the identifiers that appear everywhere on all these data sets. And we get those identifiers and we do probabilistic linking and we create the database that way. So every time an event happens, either every 6 months or every year, we get a data feed from different organizations and we add them to the database. So we're building the pedigree, but we're also creating the phenotypic profile of everybody. We're adding to the electronic life history of the individual, and so the database grows every year. Yes?
Do you have any barriers to linkage? Could you link it to criminal records or is it, they're public records? So could you link it?
You said criminal records? Yeah.
They're public records. So,
Yeah, the criminal records, there's a quick short answer and a slightly more nebulous answer. The quick short answer is that what's not on this graph, because we haven't quite done it yet, we have 20 years of the juvenile justice system. We just got approval. It took about 2 years of legal wrangling. We just got that. So we're linking that. So on the juvenile side, we're about to, it's going to become an official feature of our database. And it's about 300,000 individuals, I'm going to say something in that order. The public criminal records are public, you're right. But, and I don't do crime research myself, but my understanding is that you can look at them case by case, but to get a full download of the entire resource is a little harder. If not, I haven't been able to figure that one out yet. With the RDC, with the Research Data Center, we're going to link to them. You can actually get to the main data sets that are, sorry, somebody help me out, the FBI, no, the Crime Victimization Survey, is that the one? We're going to be able to link to that through the RDC. Well, ours is going to be that's going to be Utah focused, but yeah, so that's down the road. So those are two, one that's happening right away and the one that'll take a little bit of time. So we built this database. We had the privilege when Joe Biden was still vice president, for the days, and he was very interested in how we were able to take all these disparate data and put them into a database, and he was interested in, could this be a model for the country? So we actually spent a day with our team, and we were able to at least explain to him how we did it and what are the challenges of it. It hasn't happened, but at least are getting some attention at the federal level to be using this as a model. And speaking of John Huntsman, I was saying before that most of you came in, so this is John Huntsman Jr. right here, who was our then governor, now ambassador to Russia, and Orrin Hatch, his head is just right behind there. Okay, enough name dropping, all right. Early life conditions and survival. So this Lexis diagram is actually one of the things we put in the original grant, and it's very busy, and all these colored spots are just showing you where the data coverage is that we have in the data to be able to look at the entire population for well over a century. And you can look at those cohort lines and just show you that depending upon what cohort you're looking at, you will get information about that individual over time. And so it's not only the census records. We work with Steve Ruggles, his group with IPUMS, to help us organize the census data, but then we have all the other wrapping around it, which is all the health data. And so you put all that together, and as you watch different cohorts go through time, you can see that you're going to get a lot of rich information. It's often never consistent for any one cohort, but a lot of things are consistent. So this is our argument to build this framework, and we've had other people reuse this data for various purposes, and that was one of our aims, of course. Sorry, I know this is going to be hard. It is hard to read. This is just to give you an idea. Let me just blow this up a little bit. So these are the kinds of things that we can see in the historic record that we think are indicative of living conditions, adversity, advantages during the course of your life that we can see in the historic record. And so this was our menu, and I'm just going to quickly scroll through this. These are just the kinds of things, and way over to the right we have literature to support every one of these to show that they have a lasting impact into adulthood in terms of health consequences. And so this is the kind of data warehouse we're creating for early life conditions that you can use for studying aging, doing aging research. And there are some things that we're just not going to be able to capture, just the nature of the data. I will say some of you may be familiar with ACE, adverse childhood experiences. This is used in the clinical realm a lot, and I think a number of surveys use this. This is where people are asked about their adversity in childhood. We don't use the ACE measures because ours is not a recall approach. Ours is using the administrative data, the medical data, to be able to reconstruct adversity that way. So we don't rely on the recall, but this is an alternative way to do it. So if you actually are recruiting subjects, this is what you would likely end up using if you were interested in early life conditions. Okay, let me just turn to some of our findings. So one of the things that we wanted to do is that we were interested in really a kind of comprehensive view of early life conditions. So one of our earlier papers, this is about 10 years ago, where we wanted to have a comprehensive view of childhood and middle adulthood. And this is sort of the start of our investigation. And in each of these papers, I'm just going to give you a few highlights, and please ask questions as I go. And one of the things that we found in this very early paper was that one of the things we argued is that when we think about early life conditions, we think about poverty, which is important, of course, and we think about parental skill sets and the neighborhood and things like this. One of the things that we did is that we modeled this because we could fit nice frailty models with these survival analyses, and we could get the size of the impact of this sort of shared frailty. But then we included this thing we call familial excess longevity, which is a summary measure for everyone in this room has this measure where I can summarize the longevity pattern of all of your blood relatives. We have a few papers to be able to develop this idea, and then we actually controlled for familial excess longevity, and that shared frailty almost went away. And so we like to think of this, one of our early efforts were the familial excess longevity, the history of your longevity. That's when you are born, when you are first born, that's the legacy that has been, that you carry forward with you. And that is almost like an empirical metric that is better than the kind of kitchen sink frailty. And so we've often used this to sort of control for your endowment for longevity that we can measure in our data. Yes?
But isn't frailty endogenous to some of your shared background, the life in which your ancestors lived can be correlated with current circumstances, I imagine, like poverty?
It is. We've tried different, it's a good question. We've tried it different ways where we take only the ancestors that to sort of get the causal and the chronological order correct, we can go backward in time. This way we can go backward in time, forward in time, we can go laterally. So if we want to be able to go backward in time, at least we have the causal order. You're right, this thing can be correlated with current conditions, and so that should serve to diminish the effects of the other things that we can measure, which are behind this box. But we're controlling for this, and we can see its effect on the other more contemporaneous covariates. So I mentioned earlier, one of the key traumas, if you will, adversities, is when you lose your parents when you're a child. And so there is in the demographic history for everybody in the database, this is something we can easily observe. And I think in everybody's book, this is an absolutely disruptive event in a person's life. And typically these happen for exogenous reasons. When somebody dies really early, not always, but almost always, it's an accident because the child is under 18 and the parent dies very, very early. And we have this is we observe them after age 65, and so these are the relative risks for women after 65, men after 65. We still see enduring effects in older ages for not what I would call large effects, but they do tend to show up more for females than for males. There's a lot of complexity here. It's not just one story, and it's not just losing the mother or the father, but we do see enduring effects of this undoubted trauma in childhood. But then we wanted to look at also looking at early parental death in childhood. And one of the things we wanted to do was to understand how the parent died. And so we are able to look at the way in which the parent died. And so in the most extreme cases, we do find suicide. This is not maybe too surprising, that parental suicide has this dramatic effect on shortened lifespan for the child, also their own risk of suicide. And so this is the relative risk of dying from suicide, and we wanted to compare it to another disease outcome, cardiovascular disease. These tend to be greater than these, although those are not statistically different. But for the men, it is clear that the suicide risk to the offspring due to the suicide of their parent when young, it actually has this quite dramatic effect. The other thing I want to point out is that because we're in Utah, we can actually look at the role of religion. And if you're baptized in the Mormon faith, you have access to a social support network. Not that if you're not LDS, you could be Catholic or Protestant in Utah, but the religious environment for you is less robust than in the LDS case. But you do get very strong benefits of being a member of the Mormon faith, protecting you from suicide. So, maybe Durkheim was right. We pursued this question about early parental death, and our aims are really quite broad in terms of the kinds of outcomes. So in this paper, We were looking at the effects of early parental death on depression and substance abuse later in life. So we can see this in the medical record, depression and substance abuse later in life. But we wanted to see whether or not your family history of, in this particular study, we wanted to look at the role of family history of suicide. So we take the entire database and we look for your ancestors, and do we see what levels of family history do we see of suicide among your ancestors? And we can observe that over a 100-year period, so we can get a pretty good look at the family history of suicide in your family. And so this is, we have a metric for this, and this is just a distribution. So those out here on the right tail are the ones that have a disproportionate share of suicides in their family. And so everybody had this metric. And it turns out that for females, the risk of you engaging in substance abuse and your risk of depression goes up as your family history of suicide goes up. And it's significant in the case of depression, so that if your family history is strong, your chances of you yourself having encountering major depression actually goes up. So here we're able to use family history information as to stratify and look at the susceptibility for major depression. It did not hold up for males.
Would you consider that to be some marker of inheritance or some kind of mental health issues?
So yeah, so what we have tried to argue is that in this age of genomic medicine, where everybody wants to get their sequence data, everybody wants to get genetic markers for whatever the condition is. One, they're very expensive. It's very expensive to get. And it's hard to get large samples of individuals with sequence data. That's changing. It's getting cheaper. And we took the approach here is that, first of all, we don't necessarily have necessarily a clean list of things that are related to the risk of genetic risk of depression. So we have been using family history of the phenotype in question. And often they perform extremely well. And in cases where we have both gene susceptibility and family history, often the family history measure often trumps the genetic effect. So I'm not calling this a genetic effect. Your family history, it's a combination of a lot of things, of course. But it is showing a proclivity in your family, and it could be environmental, it could be shared environment of some type. But as a first cut, from a database standpoint, we can actually get our hands on this measure. We have developed metrics for this, and so we can stratify the population. Yes.
For, you see a lot of data. Do you know anything about people's where they were actually raised? So if they've been adopted, the possibility of taking this data and looking at, for example, people with a family history of suicide, but maybe they were adopted, so they'd be probably unaware of it. Do you have enough data or records to do something like that?
Yeah, no, we indeed. So there's a interest on the adoption issue. We have to be very careful as we build genealogies, because if you get one person wrong 4 generations back, then you've got everything else is wrong below that person in the pedigree. So so adoptions in the historical era is generally not a problem to look at in our database. Typically, it's a step parent adopting you. That's often what happens. So one biological parent dies, the surviving parent remarries, and the new parent adopts that child. We can see that time and time again. So that's easy. When you come to the modern era, I don't know what it's like in Pennsylvania, but the laws in most states are extremely, extremely strict. And we are having open discussions about what we can and cannot see in our database in the contemporary period. So adoptions are a challenge. And we would never ever want to get in a position where we would potentially breach those privacy concerns. So, yeah.
Just to get a sense of the distribution that you had before,
Yeah.
the histogram. So in your database, nobody has 0.
Sorry, it should, the axis should be at 1, actually. Oh, sorry, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, thank you. You're right, sorry. When we did this, you can actually be in a family where suicide is very unlikely. That can happen. It just never happens. Our assessment, though, was that it was often completeness of the pedigree. So it was not true low risk of suicide in your family history. It was just that we had thinner pedigrees. And so our conclusion was that maybe those under 1 were often, in this particular analysis, those under 1, we treated them as sort of maybe more problematic, lower quality pedigrees. We can always revisit that, but that's what we did in this particular paper.
Goes back how many generations? Is part of the decision.
So we can see what people died from since 1904 is the beginning of our vital record system. So we have cause of death from 1904 to the present. So it's about 100 years or so.
I don't know if this has any effect on these lineages and with this new DNA testing, and one of the things that you read about is that parents are not the parents, and then people find out that they and do you see any of that here? I mean, do you link DNA from the person to the parents or things like that?
Yeah. So okay, this is take a minute to explain. So our effort, this effort with this database, we as a for the whole population, we are not attempting to, nor could we afford to get DNA sequences on, let's say, all the living people in Utah. That would be just that would be an amazing undertaking and fraught with lots of challenges. So what we do is that we identify families, like in this case, suicide. So we're actually doing the genetics of suicide. I'm on a project where we actually have DNA that we collect from the medical examiner, and we have a protocol to collect DNA that way, but it's specifically on suicide. So you can do genetic studies, but it's very concentrated on that family or this pedigree or a set of pedigrees. So we don't have it on everybody. In cases where we determine that paternity is an issue, then we will use that information. But we don't get it wholesale. However, I will say that because of the way the data come to us is that we get multiple reportings of you and who you're related to. So we'll get it in one data set, another data set. So there's lots and lots of triangulation. So we're able to, we have protocols to be able to decide what we think is the most likely, what is most likely true. We could still be wrong, but we do lots of triangulation. So that's not a guarantee that we don't have paternity wrong, but we don't get into the paternity checking business. So, yeah, I mean, you hear different estimates. Has anybody heard an estimate? The genetic counselors that I work with say it's in the 4% range, something like that. Something like that, yeah. Okay. Oh, so, okay. I know so we have an interest in late onset diseases, so we are certainly interested in things related to the elderly, and that would include Alzheimer's disease. We have a long-standing affiliation with the Cache County Memory Study, which is a fairly famous cohort study that's been where they recruited over 90% of the people in this county in northern Utah, and it's been a prospective project. And we have linked all these individuals, because they're in Utah, to the Utah Population Database. This is it's a very northern part of Utah. It's a collaboration between us, Utah State University, and Duke. That was the original NIA grant. And it's largely an LDS Mormon community. Smoking and alcohol rates are exceedingly low because they're generally practicing Mormons, and so that kind of cleared out a lot of the confounds. So one of the things, sort of the stress and the pathways from that early stress of early parental death, we've shown in a few papers, associates with the risk of Alzheimer's disease after age 65. And so in the case of, they happen at different ages, but in terms of if your mother dies when you were, this is as a teen, so you are a member of this study, your mother died when you were a teen. We did find that there was an excess risk of Alzheimer's disease among those women, or those children, if when the mother died and the father remarried, then your risk was reduced. So you lost a parent, but then there was some recovery, I'll say, because the surviving parent remarried. And then we see a similar pattern here for paternal death, and happens at a younger age. And so there is this initial effect in this analysis of early parental death and some mediation due to remarriage. Yes?
How often do people not get married counted like this? Wouldn't it be quite unusual that this is single and LDS counted?
Yeah. I don't think it's, I wish I had a number. I don't have a number for you off the top of my head. I could just tell you that Utah is no different than other populations in that if you have young children, remarriage rates, especially for women, are low. Yeah. Afterwards, I'll tell you about there's one theological complication, which is very interesting, actually has demographic consequences, but maybe I'll postpone that. There's another which we didn't really delve into in this paper. So. We've also, in terms of the Cache County study, we did capture a number of biomarkers. We did, one of them was C-reactive protein, and we wanted to look at the enduring effects of early death of a parent during childhood. And this is kind of a busy table, but this is basically, no matter what model specification, each column is a different model. And this is just the percent of your family members that died when you were a child. So it's a per 1% change. And so we found significant effects of excess levels of C-reactive protein as a marker of inflammation. So there was some, at least biological evidence about the association between that early trauma and later life health. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm going to say them very quickly. I'm going to skip over a lot of slides there just to get to the end. But so the one, I'll just pause on this one. So the one issue that we're doing one approach we're taking right now is we want to create something in the tradition that we see a lot in the psychosocial health arena, where you want to come up with a global scale of stress or adversity. So the Holmes-Ray and others, classic scales, of course, take a lot of measures to create a scale. So we are working on what we're calling the decade scale demographic childhood adversity exposure scale. And that's taking all that information that I showed you many slides ago, where we're trying to be able to come up with a composite that does an outstanding, and the validation of it is that how well does it predict later life health and mortality. So Charlson Comorbidity Index is another one. So we're doing that just from the purely demographic data. It isn't the ACE scale, it isn't recall. And so this is something that we're actively working on that'll become part of the database. And I'm going to skip through some of the details of this. So the title of the talk I gave today was basically based upon this paper that we've been working on with the Dutch. This just came out in the European Journal of Population, and where we wanted to look at the extent to which there is mortality in your childhood. So you end up being the survival from your family, where there was high levels of mortality in your family and in your community. This is males on the left, females on the right. And basically, it just shows you that if you have depending on how many deaths you have in the family, is there an enduring effect of overall mortality? Yeah, it's significant. It's not huge. And then if you look at the cause of death, like if you have a death in the family, and then what is at your risk of particular causes of death, and almost all of them are above 1. And so it seems systemic. So if there's death in the family early on, not only is your overall risk elevated, but it seems to be hitting almost all of the different causes. Some of the ones on the bottom are not significant, partly because the numbers get a little small. Let's skip that. Okay, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to, okay. So one of the, as demographers, we're often focusing on mortality. One of the things that we want to do is, and we are working on now, is this idea of escaping healthy longevity. And basically what that means is that we're using our resources to identify the elderly who basically don't get sick. And we're trying to look at those features of in early life, certainly in midlife as well, that contribute to whether or not you basically never get sick. And this is just an example of data that we use from the Medicare files. And these are, we're using these trajectory models. And in this particular case, we found 4 distinct trajectories using Medicare files of their electronic health record. And on the vertical axis is the Charlson Comorbidity Index, so higher is worse, lower is better. And there's actually, in this sample, there's about 8% of these women that are on this line at the very bottom. They just don't get sick. They're older, and they just don't get sick. And no matter, and if you look in the literature, you will often find in the literature, people that are studying these age groups, there's always this little tiny fraction where people just don't seem to get sick, either by self-report or by medical records. So we are interested in examining these escapers and what conditions might be happening early life, or is it more common to have a sibling who's an escaper, and so on. Yeah.
What is the definition of not getting ever sick? What does that mean? So not getting cardiovascular diseases, cancer, what does that mean?
So we're basing this on the Charlson Comorbidity Index. It's basically 18, the main 18 conditions that that afflict the elderly. So it includes everything you just said plus others. And in this particular graph, but in general, we want to be able to look at people that are dodging every bullet. They're just not getting cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. They're not getting any of these, according to the medical record. So for us, escaping, right now we're using the Charlson Comorbidity Index listing of conditions. And we're saying if you're avoiding all of these, there's something quite astounding about you at these ages. And we want to elaborate on this point. It's really healthy lifespan, but using it not from self-report, but really just mining the administrative data, because we can look at all the electronic medical records in the state, and we can create these typologies like this of putting people in bins. And we're very interested in that bottom. We're interested in all of them, but we're very interested in that bottom group. And then we'd like to start recruiting them and try to learn as much as we can about them. And so you can do this very robustly when you have the full state, a very large data set. So we have about 500,000 people in this data set that we can look at a continuous record of their medical encounters. So 1 minute, okay. Hyunjin, this is from our study? Okay. That's all I'm saying. So we're looking at grandmother effects on grandchildren, and this is with Jerry Berman and Irma Elo, and so this is our NSF project. That's another kind of almost early life conditions. I'm going back even in further generations, and I'm going to skip that. And so my summation is, I know I've given you a lot of little tidbits here, but just to leave you with these thoughts. One, I hope I've tried to convey to you our passion and our strong feelings about linking administrative records in the way that we have. I didn't really talk too much about historic shocks. That's another line of research which I thought we didn't have time for. And in order to do this kind of work, we have to obviously worry about survival selection into these older ages. I've tried to at least convince you that maybe family health history instead of genetics is a useful and available, and I'll say cheaper to get indication of an early life condition. And one of the issues, that second to the bottom point, I'll just say is that, and this is something that we're continuing to work on, is this complexity of the sheer volume of early life conditions that are there, and this challenge of making causal statements. That is a perpetual challenge for how we do our work. And I will take a breath there. Thank you.
Again, just to repeat what I said at the beginning, was a nice way to end with the project with Hyunjun and others, because you'll be around a lot later today and tomorrow, but in the future as well. So again, thanks very much.
Thank you.